Let's get started with the recent attack of Ukrainians on Russian in Sevastopol. They were attacking civilians, and they have used attacks from the United States using cluster bombs. Could you elaborate on the details of this attack and then talk about why would Ukraine need such an attack to on civilians and without the United States and Europeans providing intelligence to Ukrainians, was that possible for them to do that?
Well, yes. I mean, there are many questions in your question. And the first one is probably the easiest one is to have a picture of what happened. Apparently, 5 ATACMS missiles were shot at the area surrounding Sebastopol. And in fact, we see that those 5 missile targets targeted 3 areas which are basically on the coast. There's a huge bay in Sebastopol, which is used, especially in summertime, by the locals just to go for swimming and so. And those 5 missiles were targeting 3 areas, 3 beaches, in fact. Now, these missiles were in fact intercepted by Russian anti-missile defenses, but one of the missiles was destroyed in the air, but released bomblets. Now, these ATACMS missiles that were provided by the US already 1 year ago, in fact, they were equipped with those bomblets. Bomblets are basically used. I mean, they were developed in the 80s in the West for tactical missiles, but also artillery ammunition, in order to be able to break a possible, or what was considered as possible, a Soviet attack. And that was, in fact, the project was under the name of Assault Breaker. The idea is that when you are taken by surprise and with the enemy attack, you may not have all the capabilities in order to target very precisely your enemy. And you would then use those bomblets to have kind of an area effect on your enemy. And so you don't need to have very precise targeting. You can just bomb an area and that will destroy. I mean, some of the bomblets, I mean, they're mixed type of bomblets. Some might be anti-armor, and they have what we call a shape charge. A shape charge is an explosive charge that concentrates the explosions on one point, and that allows to pierce and to go through armor. And these are very small charges, but they're powerful enough to break the upper armor of tanks and armored vehicles, because usually tanks have the lightest armor on the top. The harder and strongest armor is on the side and on the front for obvious reasons. And on the top, usually at top and rear, you have the thinnest armor. And this can be then pierced by those bomblets falling from above. And these charges can be combined with fragmentation, a fragmentation body, meaning that they can act, as I said, to pierce armor, but they can also explode radially and disperse fragments radially, and thus have an anti-infantry effect. So these bomblets were provided to Ukraine in last year, in 2023, with the idea that it would help. I mean, they were designed to break a Russian assault, but in fact, since the Americans had no longer any other ammunition, they provided this to support the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian counteroffensive last summer. This is not designed, these weapons are not designed for an attacking force, but are designed for a defending force. But okay, that's the that's the way it is, and that's what the Ukrainians have. But the point is that these bomblets have an anti-personnel effect. And when the Ukrainians on last it was on Sunday, I think, don't remember what that was exactly, or yesterday it was. I mean, Sunday or yesterday.
Yeah.
Well, when they targeted those beaches, they definitely targeted infantry, because this type of ammunition is precisely to target infantry. So. And here the first question is that how come a country can deliberately target civilians who are, in that case, enjoying the sun on beaches? So we have here a clear demonstration that of something that I have demonstrated and also discussed in my last book, that the Ukrainian leadership tends to concentrate on soft targets and civilian targets because they are not able. Probably they don't have the target acquisition systems and not the power. They are not powerful enough to attack the. I mean, they do to some extent attack the Russian forces, but they expect to have more political leverage by attacking civilians, and that's the reason why Ukrainians, because what we have seen on these in the Sevastopol area is in fact a replication of something we have already seen in Belgorod and all that, because these attacks in Belgorod area that we have already discussed, these attacks targeted on also civilians. So what's the purpose of attacking civilians? And here, in reality, if you analyze the process, it's a similar process as the terrorist attack. The terrorist attack, or this kind of attack that targets civilians, in fact, use the civilians as a way to create a leverage towards the political authorities of the country. It's a mean to the two way of actions here. And what I'm saying is not something that I have invented or found out myself. I based, and I was, in fact, when I wrote my book on countering jihadi terrorism, I came across a lot of writings by the Al-Qaeda in Yemen and the Islamic State. And they described the process very precisely and very bluntly, in fact. The idea is the following, is that since you cannot put enough pressure on a government, then you attack the population with the idea that the population would then attack their own government and say that you are not you are not protecting us enough, or you should not engage in that conflict, or you should withdraw from that conflict, and all that. From an Islamic State perspective, the idea was to push in that case the European, I mean French or Belgian population, to press the Belgian or French authorities to withdraw their troops from Syria and Iraq. And here we have exactly the same kind of approach. And by the way, that was also described, and that's very interesting, and I mentioned that in my books. That was described by Ukrainians themselves. The idea is to put pressure on the Russian population so that they put pressure on the Russian government to stop the war. So we are exactly in the same kind of mechanism that I have described in my various books on asymmetric warfare, because this is exactly the way it works. You attack the population, and you hope that the population would then, in fact, turn against their own government. So it's a kind of indirect warfare. And by the way, this is exactly the same thing that the Israelis are doing when they bomb the Palestinian population in Gaza. And again, they explain that also very bluntly. Again, it's not my invention. The idea is that they bomb the civilian population, hoping that then the Palestinians would turn against Hamas. This is the idea. So we are talking about it's technically it's terrorism. Technically, it's terrorism. Then the word terrorism, it becomes a political designation, if you want, and it's politically motivated whether you decide to use that word or not. But technically speaking, this is terrorism. This is the way terrorism works. It's a way to put pressure on a government by using its population. And and that's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. You know, the Ukrainians are not able to repel the Russian forces. I mean, they are not able to repel the the Russian forces in the Donbass area in the south of the country, but they are not even able to push back the Russians in the Kharkov area. And therefore, it's tempting for them to attack the civilian population in order to create a pressure. By the way, we had this discussion already when we were talking about the attack on the Crocus center in Moscow, or near Moscow. This is exactly the same principle. This is exactly the same principle. So what we are witnessing is in effect a terrorist attack using instead of using guys with a bomb bomb belt, with bombs. You just use an ATACMS. That's the only difference. The way you bring the bomb to the population is the only difference, but technically it's. Now, that raised, of course, the question of how the US understands that, because as the US provided the first batch of ATACMS last year, they informed, and they were adamant that the Ukrainians guaranteed the Americans that they would not use those ATACMS against the civilian population. And that was explicitly said by the US as they were asked whether Ukraine might use these weapons against civilians. So the question and the possibility that the Ukrainian would use these missiles in that's the kind of situation that was already raised almost 1 year ago. And apparently, the Ukrainian government gave all the guarantees to the US that they would not do it, but they did it. And here, this is absolutely clear because there is no military objective in the area. By the way, it's the same thing in Belgorod. Belgorod, the places that were attacked had no military objectives. So this is purely against civilians. So that raised the question of the morality of the Ukrainian establishment. That's one thing, but it also raised the question.
I have a little question here. Do you think if the United States didn't want them to attack Russia with ATACMS and with cluster bombs, how, and And at the same time, you're hearing that they're talking about that Ukrainians can attack Russia inside Russia. And how would they attack Russia without ATACMS, without cluster bombs?
Well, that's a good question, but you may assume, and I think even the Russians have understood that in the border area you may have armored forces, and I think even the Russians have understood that. And even in Crimea, by the way, because it's not the first time. I mean, the attacks on Crimea are not new. This is not a new thing. It has happened since the beginning of the special military operations. So when the issue of using weapons, long-range weapons, against in the depth of Russian territory, this was considered as beyond this border area. And I think the Russians understood that. So it's not that they take the border as a strict limit. They understand that war is war, and that even if the theater of military operation, the TVD, as in the Russian terminology, the TVD Ukraine is not strictly confined by the political border. But obviously, it may extend a little bit over the border, and the Russians have understood that. But they consider that if you go deeper into the territory, then it makes no sense, because then you would attack mainly civilian objectives, and therefore there is no point having this. And that's why the Russians were upset when the Europeans, I mean the Brits, and then the Americans said that it's legitimate to use weapons in the depth of Russian territory. So that's something that the Russians were upset about. But again, they understand that you may have, and when you have, for instance, the combat in the Kharkov area, you have necessary some troops on the other side of the border. So it would be stupid from a Ukrainian perspective to wait that the Russians just cross the border to shoot at them. Of course, if you have indication that you have a tank battalion that is just over the border, even if it's in the Russian territory, they will attack that. And the Russians understand that. Now, the Russians understand that. But of course, it's the Russians will consider that if you attack military forces, okay, that's part of war. But when you start attacking civilians, then you are no longer in a war situation. And by the way, if you look at it from a Ukrainian perspective, and you can say, why would you start bombing a population that you want to liberate? Because since the beginning of the special military operations, the Ukrainians are promising that they would liberate Crimea, that they would expel the Russians and save the population from the Russian occupation. And now they are bombing this population. So you see, it doesn't make any sense.
Zelensky's government just mentioned. Zelensky's government is saying that these are civilian occupiers.
Yeah, well, yeah. So of course you can turn the thing in what the problem is, that a civilian is a civilian, or from a humanitarian law perspective, these are civilians, period, and there is no good and bad civilians. They are civilians, and if you have some strategic thinking, then you will start saying, okay, these are civilians. We hope that the civilians will help us to get rid from the Russian military, and therefore we will spare the civilians, regardless of who they are, because you don't have their passport, so you cannot just have a missile that attacks the guys who has the right or the wrong passport. So this doesn't make any sense. But that indicates another thing. It indicates also that and by the way, this is the same thing we are witnessing in Palestine, that the US has absolutely no control over its allies. And and that's something that worries me a little bit, because you have on both sides, both on in Palestine as in Ukraine, you have a US providing weapons and saying, well, we provide weapons, but they the Israelis on the side and the Ukrainians on the other side have promised that they will not use that against civilians and all that. And in both cases, we see that it's just not the case. And that, in fact, these allies of the US do whatever they want. They promise whatever in order to have the weapons, and then they do whatever they want. So the US has absolutely no control over these guys. And there is not even the respect between each other, because even the Israelis do not respect the Americans, obviously, and even the Ukrainians do not respect the Americans. They consider that the Americans are just here to provide weapons and provide support, period. And now then they have absolutely no say in the way the Ukrainians can use these weapons. The same on the Israeli side. And that's exactly, by the way, how you see these mass murders and war crimes committed with the benediction of European countries. Because at the same time, you have no European government protesting against that. And again, it shows that we have a very differential approach as to terrorism and attack on civilians. You know, all these attacks that have been documented, by the way, in Belgorod and all that, nobody raised that question. And you had this conference in Switzerland and all that. Nobody put that as a condition. And everybody knows that the Ukrainians are not specially respecting the international humanitarian law. And in that respect, it's interesting to see that you had recently an article in the New York Times that, in fact, explains that the Ukrainian government, or Zelensky government more precisely, doesn't abide by international law and human rights. So we know that even the media, and even the American media, and the New York Times is probably one of those mainstream media that have been so supportive for Ukraine. But when they say that Ukraine is not respecting the human rights or humanitarian law, whatever, no, not a single European government reacts to that. And that shows, in fact, that when we say we fight for values, democracy, and every kind of thing, in fact, it's not true. We fight for the values that we have decided are applicable in this moment and in this place, period. But it's no, if those values, if we don't apply this value, this is not a problem. This is, do what I'm saying, don't do what I'm doing. In fact, this is exactly the problem. So we see that in that example, that it shows really that the Ukrainian have become rogue in some way, and are not abiding by any rule, not even the rules, or the rules that they have decided with their main allies. And that shows, by the way, and again, also the reaction of the West show that the West has no longer any option. They see that they are losing the whole thing, and they have no possibility to they have no way to change the situation, and therefore they are I would say, obliged to go into extreme solutions. It's in French we use the word to flee forward. It's a it's a way of fleeing forward because you are not able to find a solution. There's no strategy. We have discussed that already on your channel, that the West doesn't know what would mean a victory for Ukraine. Even Lord Austin, we have discussed that already, was not able to articulate any kind of strategy or any objective or any definition of what could be a victory for Ukraine. Meaning that from that point, when you have no strategy and nothing, you're just you're on the way of losing, in fact. And that's a dangerous moment, because when you feel that you are losing and that you have nothing to hold, then you start doing this kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing we may see happening more, probably, because that's the last resort to some extent. And that's worrisome in my view.
Yeah.
So that's what we can say with this attack. I think it's also interesting to see that this terrorist attack happened at the same time that you had also some terrorist attacks in Dagestan. You had two in Dagestan, but also two in Abkhazia, this is the Russian-speaking part of Georgia. And at the same time, by the way, so you have, in fact, 4 attacks. I mean, the attacks in Sevastopol, which were probably more than there were 5 missiles, and then you have those 4 terrorist attacks in Abkhazia and in Dagestan, and that reminds me. I have mentioned a couple of times, I think, this study, not a study, it was more that it was the outline of a strategy that was made by the Rand Corporation in April 2019. And in this strategy, you have exactly what we have seen, which is described. Again, we have seen Sweden, Finland going to NATO. This was in a strategy. We have seen rearming Ukraine. This was in a strategy. We have seen the threat of attacking Transnistria and Moldavia. This was already in the strategy. We have seen and we have seen already the confrontation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This was in a strategy as well, and now we are witnessing terrorist attack in the Central Asia, which has already occurred in some way before. There was some issues last year in Kazakhstan. But here we have directly in Central Asia, the Central Asian part of Russia, you have direct attacks. And that was in the strategy as well. So all the items, and I would say even the chapters of this strategy outlined by the Rand Corporation, all that has been realized physically. And we see this scenario unfolding very precisely as it was described in this 300 pages document of the Rand Corporation. I really encourage everybody to read that document, because it shows exactly what we are witnessing since 2.5 years in Ukraine. And it even shows something that the analyst of the Rand Corporation wrote in the same study. They proposed that strategy to the Pentagon, because the Rand Corporation is a think tank of the Pentagon, so it was this strategy for the U.S. government. But there is a special chapter devoted to the risks of this strategy, and the risk involved by applying this strategy. And in that chapter, the RAND Corporation guys were equally precise as for the strategy itself, because they said, if you apply this strategy, you have to be aware that there is a risk of Ukraine losing, having huge losses in personnel. They will lose territory, and they will be pushed by Russia into a unfavorable peace. And that's exactly what we are witnessing. So it's of course more detailed in that. I'm just summarizing the idea. And it's interesting that in these risks, by the way, the analysts of the RAND Corporation caution the U.S. government. They say, well, be careful, because because the sanctions and all that are also part of the strategy, of course. And they say, be careful, because our assessment of the Russian economy at this stage, and that was 2019, our assessment of the Russian economy is probably not accurate as it should. And probably the Russian economy is probably more resilient than what what we assumed in designing this strategy, meaning that the risk that the strategy fails is very big. And in fact, we are witnessing exactly that. We are witnessing exactly that. Even the caution of the RAND Corporation analysts are even can also be verified. So we see that the West has engaged into a strategy to use Ukraine with the purpose of weakening Russia. They didn't care about Ukraine whatsoever. They just wanted to weaken Russia. And despite the warnings that are contained in the original strategy, they did it. They underestimated the capabilities of the Russian economy. They underestimated the capabilities of the Russian military. They overestimated the resilience of European countries, and they overestimated equally the capabilities of the Ukrainian forces. And the result is a total failure. And that's exactly what I've written in my first book, Operation Z. And that was written in the summer 2022, meaning that everything I'm saying now was identifiable in 2022. And since then, everything has been confirmed. So I'm very coming from strategic intelligence background, and having worked with all strategic intelligence services in the West, I'm extremely disappointed by the capacities and the capabilities of the Western intelligence services, because what I could analyze 2 years ago, and at the very beginning of the special military operation, how come no single Western country has been able to make the same kind of analysis? Because everything what we're witnessing today and what we will witness in the coming months will simply confirm everything that I could identify 2 years ago. And that questions seriously the ability of our governments and our establishments more broadly to cope with crisis. And assuming that some countries want to engage China, I'm pretty sure that we are facing a big defeat. because we tend to overestimate our capabilities. We tend to overestimate our let's say our power. We used to have this power probably 100 years ago, and probably up to World War II. And after World War II, you had all these liberation movements and all that. Things started to change. But up to, let's say, the 60s or so, we could say that the West ruled the world, definitely. And it, to some extent, it still does. But the rest of the world understands now and has the capacity to counter the West. And the West is also, from many point of view, the West is destroying itself, meaning that you have two converging movements or developments. On the one hand, you have a southern hemisphere that is developing at high speed, with people who are better educated, with countries like China, India, that are in fact pushing the rest of the world by providing industrial support, but not only, also providing with the Belt and Road Initiative, providing infrastructure and all that. So you have a global south developing very quickly. And at the same time, you have what we call the Western Hemisphere, which is falling down, which is falling, falling and failing miserably. I mean, all the countries in Europe are in economic difficulties. The Western, the German Vice Chancellor, Mr. Habeck, went to China to beg China for help, because now Europe wants to put tariff on Chinese vehicles, and Habeck understands, because of course Germany is a big car producer, and they see that it's not coming well for Germany. So he goes to China to beg China, and explaining that no, it's not a punishment. We put tariff, but it's not a punishment. It's just a reaction. I mean, kind of a strange argument to trying to force the Chinese to remove their tariffs they want to put on Western products. This is a kind of delusional approach based on this idea that the West used to be the world ruler, or the world ruler, whatever it was. I mean, the part of the world, and today this is gone, or this is in the process of going away. And this is not let's say a good let's say, I don't know, I don't find a word in in English now, but it's not
gesture.
Not just a good gesture, but it's not a good who say that, the if we anticipate that, we say it's not a good sign for the future. It's not a good sign for the future, and unfortunately we're going there. But I'm going I drifted away from those missiles in Sevastopol. Yeah. But in fact, these missiles are the tip of the iceberg that shows that the West has nothing under control anymore. And we provide weapons, and it's what we provide to Ukraine, it's out of desperation and nothing else. There is no strategy connected to these weapons. There is no objectives connected to these weapons. We don't even know what the Ukrainians want to achieve with that. We just provide that to them because the purpose of these weapons, in fact, is just to have a longer war with Russia. And this again is a stupid strategy. And even Obama said that if you engage Russia, you're not going to win because Russia has the escalation dominance, regardless of how you take the problem. And that's it. So meaning that if you engage, and that's the way, I mean, the Western countries try to go to engage Russia into a kind of attrition war, and the Russians are ready to address this question from an attrition war perspective. And we see, and we have seen that also when we discussed that with the new defense minister and all that. So we see that the Russians have understood that this is going to be a protracted war, and they are ready to engage that. The problem is that they have more resources than the West has. And we see today, we haven't addressed the question of Palestine or what's happening in Palestine, Hezbollah, and all that. But we had this, I think it was the Joint Chief of Staff, the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff, saying that basically U.S. would not be in a position to help Israel against a war in South Lebanon against Hezbollah. So meaning that we see that, and remember that originally the military strategic orientation that, I mean, that was designed a few years ago, the U.S. had decided that they could be able to wage two wars on two separate theaters. And we see that they are not even able to wage one war in Europe. Their capacities are already exhausted with Ukraine, and now they confess that they are not able to help Israel would Israel attack South Lebanon, meaning that they are not even able to not able to address one war on one theater, and they will not be able to address a second war on a second theater. And we see that in several countries now they are talking about reintroducing conscription because they don't find professional soldiers anymore, because nobody is interested anymore in being soldiers. That was also a problem in U.S. forces, by the way. Whereas in Russia, they have exactly the opposite problem, because the fact that the Ukrainians, with the help of the West, attack civilian population has reshuffled the national and the patriotic movements in Russia. So everybody now wants to join the armed forces and to participate in a war that, from their perspective, is a just war. Remember that the rationale for Russia to engage into the special military operation was to protect the population of Donbass. There was, of course, the issue of NATO and that in background, because the entering NATO was the rationale for Ukraine to attack the population, to provoke Russia, in fact. But from the Russian perspective, the purpose of the special military operation is to protect Russian-speaking individual population in Ukraine. So it's a just war from their point of view. And therefore, we have exactly, again, we have on the one hand exactly what I explained, that let's say global or more global point of view with the South, where you have more incentive to join BRICS and all that, and the West crumbling on the other hand. And you have exactly the same thing on the military side. The West is not able to and everybody understands that, because you have the different programs. If you look at the French election, the parliamentarian election that will take place next week and in a couple of weeks. I mean, they have 2 rounds of election, but one topic is to reestablish or to recreate a solid defense industry, because what they have left is no longer able to cope with a tense situation, or a situation in which France would be committed to war. So we see that the capacities are not there, the capabilities are not there. And on the Russian side, on the other hand, they prepare for that. And they prepare physically, but they're also prepared mentally to cope with the attrition or protracted war against the West. And everything we say in the West, all these attempts to reject Russians. I mean, that you ban, for instance, Russian athletes from the Olympics, or at least you ban athletes competing under the Russian flag. They can compete under a neutral flag. But last year or 2 years ago, there was the Russian athletes were banned from the these Olympics for handicapped people, and they banned right away all the Russian athletes. They banned Russian from everywhere, and all that, which was totally unnecessary. I mean, including renaming paintings in the National Gallery in London. You had this famous painting of, I think it's Degas, of the dance, the ballerinas, and originally the title of the painting was Russian Ballerinas. And the National Gallery renamed the painting into Ukrainian Ballerinas. So totally kind of stupid things that don't bring anything at strategic operational level, but just demonstrate Russophobia. And the Russian people in Russia, and not only in Russia, by the way, they are sensitive to that. They see that it's not just about helping Ukraine militarily. It's about destroying Russians, attacking Russians. As I said many times on the channel, I think also, is that I have to drink. Sorry. During the Cold War, we are fighting the Soviets, but we are not fighting Russians. We're not fighting individuals. We are fighting a system. We didn't want to become communists. We were fighting against a kind of Marxist, Leninist revolution or global revolution, whatever it was or wasn't. We will not discuss that here, but the point is that we are not fighting against individuals. We are fighting against an ideology, but we respected the individuals. Today, we see when we talk about Russians, we don't respect the individuals. We don't respect the human side of it. We just take everything in the same mixed bag and we put everything together. And by the way, nobody knows exactly what is the ideology of Vladimir Putin. Once he's a Tsarist, once he's a communist, once he's an imperialist, once he's this, that. Nobody knows. We just invent adjectives to define Putin and to define what we assume is its ideology. And that's it. And from that point, since we don't know what we are fighting against, we're just fighting against the Russians. And that's exactly what makes the Russians so strongly supportive to their government. Instead of dividing Russia with all these measures, On the contrary, we are reinforcing the sentiment of a nation. We are reinforcing the sense with the Russians that they have to defend their country and all that. So we are reinforcing the Russians. So it's totally misguided. Totally misguided.
It seems you talk about name calling Putin. I think it seems that it depends on who's criticizing Putin. If it's Republican in the United States, he prefers to call him a communist.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
it's a
exactly.
Democratic, call him imperialist. But the outcome is the same.
This is exactly that. We don't know. In fact, in reality, Putin could be considered by, let's say, European standard as a center-right figure, politically speaking. Meaning that he's a liberal, but a moderate liberal, meaning that he's in favor of free market, free enterprise, and all that, but still retaining an important role for the state in, for instance, in defense. And that's the reason why, by the way, Russia is able to have this military production to be developed so quickly, because the military industrial complex in Russia is not bound to profit. It's related to national interest, which is exactly the opposite of what we have done in Europe since the end of the Cold War, where in most countries, Switzerland, UK, Germany, Germany probably a little bit less, but France, you had the military industrial complex was strongly under the control of the government. And because essentially producing weapons, unless you sell them abroad, but even though it's not always, it cannot be a profitable activity. And in the US, it is privatized, not everything, by the way, but in a large part is privatized, and was even less privatized probably in the Cold War, but it's still the case. And the problem with the privatized military industry is that they need to have a profit in order to produce something. So if you say, for instance, to a company, well, you need to build a new production plant for artillery shells because we need them for the next 3 weeks, no company will do that, because they will say, well, this is not worth the investment. I mean, you ask me to invest hundreds of millions in a production plant that might or might not be used for the next weeks or next month. It's not worth it. So we are not going to do it. That's the reason why, by the way, the initiative that was launched by the Czech Prime Minister, Mr. Pavel, to provide Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells. By banning the discussion, we cannot measure what is at stake for Israel and for the others as well. But we understand better what is at stake for the Palestinians. But we tend to ignore that there is also a lot at stake for Israel as well. If they don't want to discuss, after all, that's their problem. But I'm not sure they will benefit from that. I think in the mid and long run, they will suffer from the absence of discussion. And you see that already. I think you see anti-Semitism skyrocketing in the West. And it's interesting because if you look at, for instance, France as an example, they say, well, anti-Semitism is increasing because of what the Hamas does. And I'm not sure it's that. In fact, if you analyze carefully what people say and how people react and the behavior, anti-Semitic behavior, you would see that the problem is it's not because the Hamas does this or not. The problem is that Israel does things that are never punished. There's no sanction for that. And that is, I think, injustice is the driver for anti-Semitism. This is the driver. It's not even whether, I think in Europe at least, nobody cares about someone if he's Jew and that. They hate Muslims because they are terrorists. And then they say, oh, well, all the Muslims are terrorists. And that's the kind of thing. Okay, that's one thing. If we could discriminate between those who are terrorists and those who are simple, normal, honest Muslim, the problem will be solved. But okay, this is one problem. About the Jews, it's something different. Is this people tend to assimilate? They say, well, the problem is that the Jews can allow themselves whatever they want. They can kill people and nobody says anything. And this is this double standard that generates anti-Semitism. If Israel would be more criticized and openly criticized and put into discussion, honestly, without, I'm not suggesting that we should be aggressive against Israel. It's absolutely not what I'm suggesting. But have a honest discussion and trying to understand what's going on and all that. And if there is a blame to be delivered to Israel, then we deliver the blame. But we don't want to do that. So we turn everything around and we say, well, there is nothing to do. If Israel, you see all these massacres and everything that has been done, including, by the way, you have people in France, they said, well, the value of a Palestinian baby is not the same as an Israeli baby, because on the 7th of October, Palestinians deliberately attacked Israelis. And while the Palestinians who are killed is just because we use a bomb and by chance we killed a baby. So it is not the same value. That's kind of absurd type of mentality. And that creates anti-Semitism. Because when you start to have this kind of discriminatory approach to death, especially when it comes to children, nobody can stand that. Nobody can stand that. And the automatic reaction to that is that these guys are absolutely ruthless and they don't deserve our respect. That's exactly the consequence. And unfortunately, since we tend to, and also in the political discussion, by the way, when we talk about Zionism and Judaism, people tend to say when you criticize Zionism, it's anti-Semitic. While for me, what is Judaism? It's a matter of religion and culture, or it's related to a people, generally speaking. While Zionism is an ideology, it's a political ideology. By the way, you even have Christian Zionists, meaning that it's something that goes beyond Judaism and all that. But the narrative in the West today tends to aggregate those two notions into one. As a result, a lot of people would like to criticize the Zionist regime in Israel, but they are not necessarily against the Jews, but they are equally treated as anti-Semitic. As a result, in fact, to some extent, you could say that the Zionists are using the Jews as human shield to some extent. And that's the problem, because since we tend to create that confusion, then the confusion comes in the spirit in the mind of the people. And they say, well, you are Jews, then you are pro-Zionists. Zionism is Judaism. So Jews are Zionists, and Zionists are whatever you may define them, but probably not good things. And that generates the anti-Semitism. And it's interesting to see, and again, here I speak about what I'm observing in Belgium and in France. And it's probably the same in the US, by the way. But in France, it's almost a caricature. By mixing the two, well, people, well, they confuse automatically, and that's the reason why they don't care whether it's a Zionist or not. You are a Jew, that's the same thing. Period. And the Jewish organizations, or better, the Zionist organizations, or Zionist organizations that are considered as Jewish organizations, they have not realized this. They don't try to make a distinction between the two. On the contrary, because they feel that using the word anti-Semitism is a way of protecting themselves. But the problem is that it's just increasing the problem to them. And it's interesting, they haven't understood that. They haven't understood that mechanism. And as a result, you will have an increase in anti-Semitism in the future. And that's very unfortunate. That's very unfortunate. And I don't understand how come people cannot understand that. It's beyond my understanding. But again, we are probably working with people who are ideologically so motivated that probably they cannot see anything else than what they think.